although this movie isn't groundbreaking in terms of story or a plot, I will say the visual effects were stunning and breathtaking enough for me to have a really good time with this movie, and it's pulled up really strongly by its final act, making this a really entertaining time that I'd recommend for just about anybody. Avatar: The Way of Water. Jake Sully lives with his newfound family formed on the extrasolar moon Pandora. Once a familiar threat returns to finish what was previously started, Jake must work with Neytiri and the army of Na'vi race to protect their home. Now, I wish I would have read that synopsis on IMDb before watching this movie because the trailers told me little to anything. Having said that, this movie, go watch it, it's really solid. So let me jump into what I really enjoyed about Avatar 2. Of course, the visual effects for this movie were always going to be grand, and of course, they lived up to that hype, and I would say exceeded it. There's not really one shot in this movie where I sat there and thought to myself, oh, that doesn't look great. I mean, everything in this movie is just gorgeous. It's saturated with lots of blues and greens, which will really catch your eye and make everything really visually appealing to watch for the entire 3 hours. You'll find yourself saying ooh and ah like you're watching fireworks on the 4th of July a lot throughout this movie, and that in itself, I think, is actually worth the price of admission alone. I mean, this movie epitomizes this idea of a moving portrait, which is just incredible, and I think James Cameron really spent a lot of time on this movie within the last 13 years because these effects are outstanding. Like, otherworldly outstanding. And one thing I want to touch upon, I did watch this movie in 3D, and I actually think that that's the way this movie was meant to be seen. I genuinely feel as though that if I didn't watch this movie in 3D, I would have been missing out on the stunning visual effects that James Cameron and his team worked so hard to put into this movie. And this is probably the only movie I will ever see in my life that I would make that recommendation to go see it in 3D. Having said that, here we are. It really adds that extra bang for the buck. Now that I'm done gushing over the visual effects, let me talk about the overall action. I was actually really impressed by the movie's action set pieces, and there's quite a few here. Most of it is undoubtedly the third act, and I would argue the entire third act is action. But whenever stuff is hitting the fan on screen, everybody's fighting each other, everybody's at war, it was a lot of fun. And I would say in those action set pieces, I would say strikes a really great balance between providing high-octane thrills that you don't really quite know how it's going to pan out with the visual effects, which I can't say that balance is struck throughout the entirety of the movie, but I really felt it in the action set pieces, and plus, it was just a really amazing feat that you could capture so much motion and still provide all these thrills. It was just really cool. I could see why this movie took probably a decade or more to make, because there's a lot here. And additionally, I think this movie did a phenomenal job of bringing you up to speed or keeping you from having to watch the previous Avatar in order to watch this movie. You don't have to watch the first Avatar to know what's going on in the second one. James Cameron does a really great job in about the first 45 minutes of bringing you back up to speed of what's going on. As someone who didn't rewatch the first Avatar from 2009 before going and seeing this movie, I thought he did a phenomenal job of summarizing everything, bringing us back up to speed of where we were so that I could follow along the story just fine. So if you're worried about watching the first Avatar before watching the second one, don't worry about it. Just go watch the second one. You'll be just fine. And additionally, although the story isn't groundbreaking by any means, I almost enjoyed the simplicity of some of it. What I mean by the simplicity of the overall story and plot is the fact that this is really a movie about a family moving and relocating. In a nutshell, that is literally the story that is at hand here, and James Cameron really kind of hones in on that fact for most of the movie. Unfortunately, it does start to sprinkle out into these subplots that do get a little bit confusing, a lot to keep track of. However, the central idea, it does remain there and it's easily identifiable. So you at least have this one track to follow throughout the movie. And to that end, I almost feel like the story that's created there is more so a conduit of the special effects rather than the story itself. You can tell here there's a clear focus on the visual effects, the nature that's going on within this movie. I can just tell that James Cameron has a profound love for nature in that regard throughout this movie. Now let me jump into what I didn't like so much about this movie. Unfortunately, I think you really feel the 3 hours. It does start to feel a little long. I think the big reason for that is about the halfway mark of this movie. I think there's this balance, the balance that I referred to earlier, completely falls off. There's a point where you're just constantly baking in the special and visual effects of this movie for what feels like 45 minutes, and the story doesn't really go anywhere. I kind of feel like the story's getting compromised for the sake of just showing off all the visual effects, which is kind of a bummer. I mean, if you love the visual effects and you don't care about the story at all, then great, but if you want a little bit more substance there, I think that's sacrificed a little bit here. And although it was really cool to look at, for me, it extremely slowed down the experience, especially since the third act also feels like it takes a really long time. Don't get me wrong, the third act the most entertaining of the movie, where a lot of the action set pieces are, but it does feel like it takes a really, really long time to wrap up. I mean, without giving away spoilers, you start this action set piece off in the third act. At one point, you get to another point, and then at one point, all of our characters end up back where they started, and the cycle repeats again, and it's like, was that really necessary? It just could have been trimmed down just a little bit. And finally, I thought the movie was a little bit too saturated in terms of its plot at some points. I mean, if I sit here and think about the 3 hour, 10-minute runtime, I could probably split the movie up into about 4 or 5 different plots, 2 of them being main plots and 3 being subplots. They do all interweave and tie into each other by the time the movie ends. However, it does get to feel a lot to keep track of. I mean, throughout the movie, I'm trying to keep track in my head, okay, while we're here visiting Jake Sully's family, where are we at with these other characters? Okay, one member of the family is going to trail off and do something else. Where are we at with them? Another member of the family trails off and does this. You can kind of lose your marbles in that way at some point. And I would say that the movie falls dangerously close into just completely losing you, but it does manage to keep everything on the rails and keep you focused enough to enjoy the movie. So friends, in the end, Avatar: The Way of Water, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I thought it was a great movie and I highly recommend seeing it. If you can watch it in 3D, I'd say that's the way to go, which is a very rare recommendation, but give that a shot because this movie, it's really breathtaking to look at. Friends, thank you so much for watching another movie review. If you like this or thought it's helpful, I'd be honored if you consider clicking the like button, clicking these end cards up above, or the links down in the description below for your viewing pleasure. Once again, I've been Bryce, and until next time, happy holidays.